Okay, good day to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are coming to us from in the world and what time you're watching this. My name's Jack Stewart. I'll be facilitating this IT Masters Charles Sturt University webinar for today. This is the first of 4 sessions. Each of those compose 1/4 of this short course, this free IT Masters CSU short course. At the end of which you will be able to get a certificate upon successful completion of the exam at the end of the unit, which can be used as one of your 3 credits towards a subject credit if you choose to go on and study a graduate certificate or master's with IT Masters and CSU. And if you're not interested in that, then hopefully you are able to just take a lot of learning and information and maybe some professional or personal interest out of the course. So I'm joined also by Lily Nguyen, who is running everything on the back end, making sure it all functions smoothly, and George Thomas, who I'll introduce properly in just a moment. And just before we get started properly, we would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge their ongoing connections to lands, waters, and culture, and their unceded sovereignty over these lands. So, obviously, there's a lot of enthusiasm about the subject matter for tonight. So we're aiming to kind of introduce some of the challenges, risks, and interesting points that are inherent to AI being deployed in an organization. So we're going to look at some management strategies and some compliance. That's compliance currently and in the future, because as with any developing technology, often the technology goes a little bit faster than the ability of regulators to keep up with it. So we're going to be looking at keeping the AI deployment risk low and help managers keep on top of future requirements as well as those current deployment needs. All of the course materials that you are seeing here tonight will be available as always via the student portal, which can be accessed at learn.itmasters.edu.au. And so Lily is likely to be dropping that into the chat shortly as well. So you can log into that learn.itmasters.edu.au portal and you can access the recordings from tonight, as well as additional readings or any other course materials that George has designated, as well as the forums where you can have discussions with your fellow students, as well as with George, our wonderful mentor. And you can also access the quizzes and things through there as well. So just a little last bit of housekeeping as well. We'll be having Q&A at the end of this session. So feel free to use the Q&A section for any questions that you have for the mentor about the content of the course. So that's what the Q&A is for directly asking questions related to the material that's being covered in the course. If you have questions or concerns about the administrative side of it, feel free to email shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au, and feel free to use the chat for discussion with your fellow participants as well. Questions that are asked in the chat, unfortunately, goes really fast sometimes, so we're unlikely to be able to catch those and pass them on for the Q&A section. We are unlikely to be able to get to everybody's Q&A to everyone's question, in the Q&A, just because of time requirements, and sometimes multiple questions get sort of asked about the same thing. So if you are disappointed that your question was not able to be asked, definitely encourage you to head to that student portal, that learn.itmasters.edu.au portal, where you will be able to engage in those conversations ongoing with your fellow students and with your mentor. And speaking of your mentor, we are also joined by the wonderful Dr. George Thomas. So he is an IT Masters subject mentor and CSU adjunct lecturer. He's also a director at DRGT Consulting. So he has worked worldwide in a bunch of different organizations related to tech in general, cybersecurity, data privacy, and AI across a variety of industries as well. Massive organizations, small organizations, and he holds a Doctor of IT, a Master of Management in IT, and other industry certifications as well. So he is a three-time Microsoft MVP award recipient as well, the most valuable player of Microsoft, times three. Very impressive. Welcome, Dr. George.
Thanks, Jack. Sorry, I was just trying to find all my buttons. Yeah, they gave me a trophy. It was kind of cool. But anyway, so thank you. Welcome everybody. Looking forward to spending the next, I guess, 4 weeks together. Well, at least an hour and a bit of the next, well, each week for the next 4 weeks. So yeah, as sort of I guess introduced, what we are looking at tonight is AI, looking at ethics, risk, and compliance. My understanding is the course is designed to be fairly kind of entry beginner level, and what we'll do over the next 4 weeks is start to build on that. So tonight is going to be really about the foundations of responsible AI. So a bit of a introduction into AI for anyone that's not as familiar with it. If you are very familiar with it, then apologies if some of the content you already know. But yeah, that's where we're going to start. So I'll just conscious that we have an hour, an hour and 15 or whatever it is. So I'll just get into the content, and yeah, we'll go from there. So I clicked and nothing happened. There we go. So in terms of the course structure, week one or module one, which is this week, is, as I mentioned, the foundations of responsible AI. So yeah, fairly introductory. We'll start at the beginning. Next week, so week two, we'll start looking at the governance, risk, and compliance in AI elements. So that's looking at things like the sort of management frameworks and standards that are available to govern risk and manage compliance within AI within an organization. Week three, we'll start to get into and for the record, in week two, we do talk about ISO 42001 and AI management systems very briefly, but we'll get really into the sort of meat of that in week three, where there's a bit more of a deep dive into 42001, what that is, and how it's structured, and some of the benefits of that. And then finally, in week four, we'll look at a bit of a practical implementation approach. So looking at how to, implement those things, implement, those sort of risk management, those governance controls, and those sort of compliance initiatives in week four. And then, with a bit of a sort of case study. So looking at a scenario and then sort of stepping through it to, I guess, show that sort of practical implementation. Well, in theory. So that's the structure. And yeah, tonight is really the introduction. And I think the best place to start, I always do this. I think even when I look at a lot of the presentations that I've done over the years and sort of subjects, I always start with a definition, or sometimes multiple definitions. In this case, I've plucked out two. There are multiple of these, but I think it's always good to start with, what is AI? And so, it's look, over the years, as I've been working in the sort of tech space for about 25, 26 years, I probably started in IT more broadly and engineering and so forth, a bit of software development in there. And then I, did a lot of work in cybersecurity. I was actually just sort of reflecting on the fact that I wrote my first paper on ethics in, well, it was machine learning, so a subset of AI, back in 2016, and I presented that at a conference over in Lisbon, and I can't believe that was almost a decade ago. So um, yeah, but I think my point was that over the years, I've sort of, tried to look at what AI actually is. And so, nowadays there's some, I guess, readily available definitions of what that is. And I've got two here, one from ISO. So that's the International Organization for Standardization. You may be familiar with them. So I think many are familiar with, ISO 9001, which is their quality standard. Many are also familiar with ISO 27001, which is their information security management system standard. But in terms of AI, they have ISO 42001, which is their AI management system standard, but then there's supplementary standards. So in this instance, 22989, which provides a lot of the sort of definitions that are used within the 42001 standard. And so the way that ISO define what is AI, and I'm just going to read it out, but research and development of mechanisms and applications of AI systems, and AI systems being engineered system that generates outputs such as content, forecasts, recommendations, or decisions for a given set of human-defined objectives. So that's what ISO say AI is. If you look at IBM, similar, artificial intelligence is technology that enables computers and machines to simulate human learning, comprehension, problem solving, decision making, creativity, and autonomy. There's also other sources as well. The Australian government, they have a definition of AI as a machine-based system that infers how to generate outputs such as predictions, content recommendations. But you see there's a general theme going on here. OECD, another globally recognized organization, they'll say it's a transformative technology capable of tasks that typically require human-like intelligence. So that includes things such as understanding, recognizing patterns, making decisions, and problem solving. So that is AI. But, to kind of bring it back into the context of what we're talking about, AI systems do pose risks. They pose risks to things like privacy, safety, security, and human autonomy. So, I think in that sort of flavor, it's really important to ensure that we've got effective governance in place, that we're adequately managing risk, and that AI development and use is safe, secure, and trustworthy. So that's what we're going to sort of tease out over the next, few weeks. So as I said, this was fairly introductory. So there's going to be a lot of words that you would have seen, that you're probably familiar with. I'm going to try and break those down. So let's look at AI. So these are some terms that come to mind when you think of artificial intelligence. Things like machine learning, cognitive computing, computer vision, deep learning, neural networks. I think here this is where I sort of break it down into almost two buckets. These are types of technology. So if you look at ML, and that's the one I just mentioned before, so machine learning is a branch or a subset of artificial intelligence. And what that does is it allows computers to learn without being explicitly programmed. And it uses things like algorithms, analyzes data, identifies patterns, and can make, predictions or decisions. It's been around for quite a long time. And, I think, as I said, I wrote that paper about 10 years ago now. I think it's been really heavily used, probably more so in the last, decade or two. Um, One thing with, machine learning, for example, is it, usually requires, specialist skills in order to, I guess, stand it up and develop it. Infrastructure can be costly. So, it's typically used by larger organizations and, wasn't necessarily available to, everybody. So, some other examples there. So, deep learning and neural networks. They deep learning uses artificial neural networks. Generative AI is an example of something that would sit within deep learning. You may have also heard of computer vision. That sounds kind of funny, but computer vision is basically an AI that allows machines to see images and videos like humans. And so I don't know if anyone remembers the whole, the Google cat thing. Was it Google Brain? That would be an example of computer vision. I'll just mention one more before I move on, which is cognitive computing. And so that is designed to simulate human thought process. So things like learning, reasoning, and understanding a language. If you look at a comparison between something like machine learning and computer vision, a key difference is that is the way that they learn. So, as I said, cognitive computing learns from data that's explicitly programmed with things like rules and regulations, and machine learning uses algorithms and does this by identifying patterns in the data. So, yeah, these are some of the, I guess, technologies that sort of sit around AI. And as I said, shortly I'll break through into the different types of AI, and there's three of them. So in terms of a brief timeline, we think about AI and we say, oh, well, it hasn't been around that long. But I think, the inception of AI actually started decades ago. It wasn't something that just appeared and I know we all know it didn't appear in 2022 with ChatGPT, but it certainly has gained huge amounts of momentum since then. And as I said, working with things like ML, 10, 15 years ago, clearly it didn't appear in 2022. That just kind of made it available to the masses. But if you kind of wind the clock back many years, and I've got this little timeline thing that is here, you'll see that there's some notable events that occurred over the last, what is that, like 65 odd years. Now this isn't all of them. In fact, if I did every single kind of notable event that happened over the last 65 years, I think I'd probably need about 10, 20 slides. But if you go all the way back to, pre-1940s, something like the Pascaline was the first mechanical calculator. And so that was invented by a French mathematician, and it was to help his father with the tax calculations. The point here was that a machine was now able to basically do a human skill. So, and that's what this did. This proved that human skills could be automated. If you fast forward to, well, not very far, but to 1940, 1950, this is where the inception period of AI kind of really happened. And you probably have heard, about or heard of, Alan Turing. And so Alan Turing was a British mathematician. He's probably well known for a couple things, not just a couple things, but at least a couple that come to my mind, which was he was the one that broke the Enigma code in World War II. And I can almost guarantee that everybody has done some form of a Turing test. And so the Turing test is I guess a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior, and it's meant to be indistinguishable from that of a human. You've probably done a reverse Turing test, which is a captcha. So, in that traditional test, the machine tries to, fool a human into thinking it's a human, but with a captcha, it's the other way around. So you must prove that you're not a bot. But point is, it was Alan Turing that sort of that invented that Turing test. Um, so we also have some other things that happened, in the 1950s. Some checkers and chess playing programs were developed out of like, MIT and so forth. And again, with the checkers um, example, excuse me one second. With the checkers example, um, what happened was the program was able to learn how to play checkers. I mean, it was apparently a bit like an amateur, but it was still able to learn. 1970s, we had knowledge-based systems. We still have those now. So these are for very specific things. So using technology and artificial intelligence to do things like medical diagnosis and so forth would be an example of a knowledge-based system. And you could see there in the 1970s to the 1990s, I think it was actually start of the 1980s, the American Association for Artificial Intelligence, so the AAAI, had their first national conference. So there was actually a national conference on AI, quite some time ago. So that's yeah, that was a long, long time ago. Um, Sorry, I don't want to hang up on this. I get hung up on this slide too long, but a couple other notable things were Deep Blue. So you may remember Deep Blue. So that was 1994. It had a chess game against the chess world champion, Garry Kasparov, and it lost. But then in 1997, it tried again and it won. So that was IBM's Deep Blue. And then finally, if we look at, the 2000s plus, this is where we start to see almost the kind of AI as we know it. The generative AI, as I said, ChatGPT, that, appeared in, I think it was 2022 from memory. But yeah, and then as I said, things like computer vision, so Google Brain, yeah, that was able to recognize cats from YouTube videos. So yeah, that's a bit of a timeline. So as you could see, that journey's kind of come along and you could sort of see how it's kind of evolved over, 50, 60 years. But yeah, it didn't just appear that recently. So, all right. So, in terms of types of AI, there are three types of AI, narrow, general, and super. And so, AI that is trained to perform a single or narrow task um, is narrow AI. And I'll get into these in a little bit more detail with some examples. General AI uses previous learnings to accomplish tasks in a different context without the need for training of models. And finally, super would think, reason, learn, and make judgments itself. And it would possess cognitive abilities that surpass those of humans. Now, this is different, as I said, from the types of technology. These are types of AI, or even, I guess, goals of AI. And let's look at these in a little bit more detail. You're going to see some very familiar things pop up shortly. Actually, you're going to see some very familiar things for the next sort of three slides, but um, the first lot's fine. The following two are a bit scarier. Okay, so narrow AI. So this is what is also called weak AI. And so it's weak. And no, you may be surprised. It's like, what? This is like the sort of very weak, narrow version. Yes, it is. These things are. So these handle one specific task like answering questions, recognizing images, limited learning. They are typically inflexible and they can't adapt outside of their original programming. They rely on things like domain-specific training data, and they require retraining for things like new tasks. And they're really widely adopted in products and services today. I mean, you could probably, normally I'd say put your hand up if you use these, but I'm probably going to get every hand, and there's a lot of hands in the webinar. But, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, some, if not all, of these particular, I guess, platforms. I mean, I've certainly used, yeah, all of them. So, I mean, I use Waze, for example, on a daily basis. Things like Waze, Google Maps, they all use AI to kind of, find optimal routes to get to your destination quickly and round around traffic hazards and things like that. I mean, those are examples of AI, but that's all that it does. One that's not on here actually is something like autopilot. So if you've got, anyone's got a, actually, I think we can use that here, can we? But, like Tesla Autopilot, for example, is another example of narrow AI. You've got Siri there, Alexa. Who else we got? What's the Google one? Google Assistant. Obviously ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, and Gemini. So all of those virtual assistants, they're all examples of our AI. Recommendation engines. So, when actually engines kind of drive me a bit bonkers sometimes, but like when if you've used Spotify or Netflix or any of those, and it kind of says, we think that you'd enjoy this, or it suggests things for you to listen to or watch, those are recommendation engines. Things like banking fraud detection, again, another example of narrow AI. You've probably worked out very quickly that everything that you do at this current sort of time, time, is time the right word? Like now, as in the present day, is going to fall into the narrow AI basket. So, which, when I show you the next slide, you're probably like, whew, I'm quite happy to stay there. Because if we start looking at general AI, this is referred to as strong AI. And yes, every single example of this is currently fictional. Phew. So examples of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, HAL from 2000. Anyone remember that? I just remember the start, where they throw the thing up in the air. But HAL, from 2000, Space Odyssey, is an example of general AI there. So these are referred to as strong AI. And I'll do a comparison side by side on how this sort of evolves. Lieutenant Commander Data, from Star Trek, another example of general AI. Jarvis, Iron Man, another example. Now, Microsoft and OpenAI claim that GPT-4 capabilities are close to human level performance. That is a claim, but it is still narrow AI. So while it's, close, it's not there yet. So yeah, that's general AI. And finally, and some of this can be, th this is a tricky one because what I'm about to show is, some examples of super AI, but maybe it's subjective, maybe it's opinion. These could probably quite easily fall back into general AI, although just based on the descriptions, and what we kind of know, it is plausible that they show attributes of super AI, which is what puts them there. So, if I kind of want to fence it, they could sit in either category, but they do exhibit some super intelligence attributes, which is why I put them into super AI. Also, if I didn't do that, there might be nothing there, which is probably true because again, this is going to be a fictional example of of super AI. And this is probably by far the scariest. So this is where we look at things like Skynet and Ava. So Skynet from the Terminator. I know I didn't want to try and avoid and make a bit of a, everyone talks about the Terminator when AI comes up. But, if you wanted to think about artificial superintelligence or ASI, again, it's hypothetical. It's hypothetical. It's designed, or I guess it's AI that has an intellectual scope beyond human intelligence. And at that most, I guess, fundamental level, this super intelligent AI, will have things like cutting edge cognitive functions, highly developed thinking skills that are more advanced than any human. And as I said, some will argue that, like Skynet, for example, is Gen AI, not super AI. Ava from, how do you pronounce that? Ex Machina, um, could also be artificial general intelligence, but does show signs of superintelligence. So I've kind of promoted them into there. So clear as mud. Um, let's break that down into the actual sort of difference. So side by side, at a very, very high level, this is what it looks like. So artificial narrow intelligence is typically going to be better than us in one task. So, for example, you go and ask it to go and research something or draft something or do something, just one particular task at a time, and it's going to do it very quickly. That's not to say it's not going to get it right, but theoretically, it's going to be more efficient, and enable higher outputs and so forth. That's ANI. If you look at artificial general intelligence, it's as capable as us in every task. So this is where the AI is kind of in parity with the human. So that's a GI, and then the scary one. Actually, I feel like the middle one's a bit scary too. But the artificial superintelligence is going to be better than us in every task. So it's almost a combination of the first two. So in other words, it's going to be, well, it's not superhuman, but it's beyond that. So just to make everyone a little bit more comfortable, this is where we are. So we're still back here. I haven't really seen, obviously the others are coming, but there's no kind of time frame of when that's going to happen. Obviously that's down to innovation and how long it takes to sort of develop these things. But I'm quite happy where we are. So yeah, that's that. I'm just going to have a very quick sip of my drink and then I'll keep going. Okay, sorry. So, why responsible AI matters. Um, so looking at, I don't know why I duplicate those titles, but looking at opportunities versus risks. And sorry, the left column is meant to be opportunities and the right column is meant to be risks. And so we'll look at why this matters, and then we'll start to look at things like those core ethical principles. So things like trust and adoption. So, transparent and ethical AI will build things like public trust. They'll encourage that sort of broader adoption across, the industry sectors. Looking at things like fairness and inclusion, that will do things like help reduce bias, discrimination, and, promote equitable outcomes. Compliance and governance. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's a significant increase, not just in AI, but across the sort of globe as far as compliance and governance requirements happen. Like you got things like, the EU Act, you got ISO 42001, but you also have legal requirements as well. So, look at Australia, for example, we've got the Privacy Act. Um, and certainly, for example, the OIC does have guidance on, the use of AI and complying with the Privacy Act. We also have our voluntary safety standard, which I'm sure at some point will potentially be revised to be not so voluntary anymore. But, responsible AI will help comply with that. Innovating with integrity, so making sure that things are done in a socially beneficial way, especially in certain sectors like healthcare, education, public services, and then looking at that human-centered design. So making sure that AI systems are there to support, not replace human decision making. So that's one thing, and we will talk a little bit more about that. In terms of risks, and as I said, we'll get into these in a bit more detail as we keep traveling through the deck. But in terms of risks, we have, things like bias and discrimination, and we've already seen examples of that, and we'll talk about some of those examples a bit later on tonight. But, poorly designed AI can reinforce things like system inequalities, especially in things like hiring decisions, lending, and law enforcement. And again, we've seen examples of that already. Um, Lack of accountability is a risk. So, there's always that question is who's ultimately accountable for a decision that's made by AI? And without that sort of clear governance, it's hard to determine who is responsible when AI causes harm. Privacy violations, I kind of mentioned the sort of Privacy Act stuff before, but AI could potentially misuse things like personal data. It could lead to things like data breaches, so breaches of confidentiality. It could lead to unintended surveillance. There's all sorts of things that can happen there. Misinformation, I mean, that's a pretty common one. Gen AI, it does have the ability to make things up. It also has the ability to influence public opinion. It can spread fake news, all those sorts of things. And then, finally, the loss of human agency. So over relying on AI, and again, we've seen examples of that, and I'm going to show a few later. Over relying on AI, especially those that don't have transparency, can really impede human judgment and decision making. So those are just some, um, opportunities and risks of AI and why it matters that it's done, and governed and managed in a responsible way. Okay, so core ethical principles. Now, you're like, where did these come from? But you're wondering that. So this was derived, and you'll see a lot of footnotes in the following slides, but this was derived from a combination of resources that, because there is not one source of ethical principles, just like everything, there's multiple sources depending who or what you ask. When I say what, like what governing body, you'll get a slightly different answer, but there is a lot of overlap. So if we look at what I've put together here, this is derived from a combination of Australia's AI ethical principles that was published a few years ago, the OECD's AI principles, the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and ISO 22989, which is that supporting standard for 42001. And so what we have here is we have eight, eight, eight core ethical principles, human-centered values, and I'll break into these and kind of show the extract of each of the um, uh, guidelines per se in the following slides. So, human-centered values, human oversight, transparency and explainability, privacy protection and security, reliability and safety, social and environmental well-being, fairness and accountability. And by the way, these aren't in any particular order. So let's start with human-centered values. So, and I sort of put footnotes there. So obviously you get access to this deck and you can have a look at it. But and also many organizations, which is what I kind of would expect, will build their principles probably based on others. So they'll take stuff from OECD or from the AI, sorry, the EU guidance or the Australian, ethics principles and kind of form it into their own, or they might reference them directly. But anyway, if we look at the human-centered values, Australia's AI ethical principles will say that AI systems should respect human rights, diversity, and the autonomy of individuals. If you look at the OECD principles, AI actors should respect the rule of law, human rights, democratic, and human-centered values throughout the AI system lifecycle. So that's yeah, that's how that's described. I think that one might actually be slightly truncated because it was actually very long. So I definitely recommend going and looking at these in their entirety because they're a bit bigger. These are kind of a bit of a abridged version. But again, having those human-centered values is an important principle in terms of ethics. Human oversight is a big one. So this one's come from the EU Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. So AI systems should empower human beings, allowing them to make informed decisions and fostering their fundamental rights. At the same time, proper oversight mechanisms need to be ensured, which can be achieved through a human in the loop, human on the loop, and human in command approaches. In other words, for every, well, not every, but for decisions, especially those that are higher risk, I know it doesn't say that, but if you're going to have a higher risk decision, and things like medical, lending, law enforcement, those sorts of things that I mentioned earlier, then human oversight is definitely something that should be incorporated. And certainly when we talk about some of the pitfalls of using AI and things like, hallucinations and so forth, it's really important that there's a human in the loop that's verifying the output. And certainly when we talk about some of the implementation processes around, ensuring that the quality of the output is there, then there's going to be a human element to that. So not just taking AI's word for it, so to speak. Okay, a big one, transparency and explainability. So this was before mentioned about things being opaque. Obviously, this is the opposite of that. So there should be transparency and responsible disclosure so people can understand when they are being significantly impacted by AI and can find out when an AI system is engaging with them. So again, this is about awareness. It's about responsible disclosure. I'm not going to read these all out, they're very long. But basically, if AI is in a decision that's made, for somebody, and as I said, lending was a big one. And I do, for anyone that's familiar with the EU GDPR, which I think was drafted or put in, was it about 2016? I think 2016 EU GDPR kind of came out, and there was that sort of 2 year grace period until 2018. It was around May 2018. But one of the elements of the EU GDPR focuses on things like automated decision making. And so there's some requirements around that. And this will firmly fall into that sort of bucket of, when I guess an algorithm or an AI is used to make a decision, whether that be to deny a loan or whatnot. There needs to be, disclosure and so forth. So that's what this requirement is. So the other thing that's interesting in here is this last one here, which is from the EU Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI, is that the data system and AI business models should be transparent. So AI systems and their decisions should be explained in a manner adapted to the stakeholder concern. So they're understanding why that particular decision was made. So it can't just all be happening, kind of under the covers in the shroud of darkness. So yeah, it's really important, I think, when AI is being used that it's clear, it's transparent, and it's able to be explained. Um, Probably my favorite one, but privacy, protection, and security. So AI systems should respect and uphold privacy rights and data protection and ensure the security of data. So again, this comes down to the design, this comes down to the controls that are in place to ensure that the adequate privacy protections and security are there and that you're complying with any of the relevant privacy laws depending on what jurisdiction that you're operating in. So there's another element here which has come from the EU ethics piece, which is around data governance. And so, besides ensuring full respect for privacy and data protection, adequate data governance mechanisms must also be ensured, taking into account the quality and integrity of the data, and ensuring legitimized access. So, that's about controlling access to the data. That's ensuring that the data is actually accurate, that it's not corrupted, that it's not wrong. And so, if a decision is made using AI and the data is bad, then the decision that AI makes is more than likely going to be wrong. So that's the element around data governance and making sure that there's controls in place to ensure that that doesn't occur. Um, right. Got a lot to get through. I should talk faster or something. But reliability and safety. So this is about the reliability of the operations and that they're and with their intended purpose. This one was interesting because I looked at this and thought, if you're thinking about something like a self-driving car, and you're using AI to self-drive the car, then I feel reliability and safety are very, very important. In fact, they're going to be right up there. So, you don't want the AI to just kind of malfunction at a critical moment. You also don't want it to make a wrong decision and put someone in danger. So here, this is where we talk about, here we've got the AI systems need to be resilient and secure. They need to be safe and ensure that a fallback plan in case something goes wrong, as well as being accurate, reliable, and reproducible. So reliability and safety is another sort of principle that needs to be followed. I think, being pragmatic about it too, in situations where reliability and safety might not be a concern, then, maybe that could be lowered on the priority list, but obviously that needs to, again, be part of the whole here. The whole thing here is that sort of that principle-based approach where you're looking at what the principles are, and certainly this is one of them. But yeah, and like all of them, same thing with, privacy and security. If your data sets don't involve any personal information or there's nothing sensitive in there, then maybe that's less important. So, then it kind of need to be taken for, the sort of use cases. Societal and environmental well-being. So clear one here. AI systems should benefit individuals, society, and the environment. Again, this is very long. I'm going to read this out, but it should benefit all human beings. That's the other thing to note, including future generations. This is an interesting one as well because and I'm going to talk about this later. There's a lot of conversations I've had about, what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen with my kids and my kids' kids. Are they going to have jobs, or is AI going to take over everything? That's something that, I've a lot of conversations about, over the the last few years. So, again, following this sort of principles-based approach, that is kind of where this would be addressed in here. Um, I think there's only two more. AI systems should be inclusive and accessible and should not involve or result in unfair discrimination against individuals, communities, or groups. Again, I've seen examples of that. Basically, this is saying that unfair bias must be avoided. And yeah, this can often happen with things like training data as well. So these sorts of things need to be considered when developing and using AI systems. Is trying to ensure there's no unfair bias, or bias in general, within the use. Now, finally, accountability. So, people are responsible for, different phases of the AI lifecycle. So, who is responsible? Who is making those decisions? There should be mechanisms put in place to ensure that, there's responsibility and accountability for the system and their outcomes, especially when, there's the potential for a catastrophic outcome. So, you can't just sort of, oh, I guess, yeah, that is the question. Who's responsible? Is it the developer? Is it the CEO? Like, who's responsible in the event that AI makes a poor decision? You can't really finger point at a machine and say, well, the AI did it. So yeah, there needs to be clear accountability on who's responsible for a particular outcome. All right, so let's look at some ethical dilemmas in AI. Um, you've probably seen this before. Has anyone seen The Good Place? Anyway, I'm just kind of digressing on
I
nonsense.
have a philosophy degree. I've seen this.
You have seen this, yes. It's a little bit dark,
I think
but
a lot of people that are on more than like three layers of internet have probably seen it these days. It's pretty heavily memed.
it is pretty heavily memed. And have you seen The Good Place?
I have. It's a great show.
Yeah, and you know the what's his name? He's an ethicist, isn't he? Um,
Uh,
but
and
yes,
it's completely left my head. Yes, the one
yes,
that's an ethicist.
yes. And this comes up a lot. And so this debate has come up a lot. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but this, for anyone that's not familiar with this, although many are, this is the trolley dilemma or the tram dilemma or the whatever dilemma. So it's a classic, I guess, thought experiment, and it's about sort of moral decision making, and it's used in in contexts like AI and autonomous systems and medical ethics and things like that. So the scenario is that for anyone that's not familiar with it, is there's a runaway tram trolley that's heading down a track towards the five people, as you could see down the bottom there, who are for some unfortunate reason tied up and unable to move. You're standing there next to the lever, and you have the power to divert the trolley onto the other track where there's only one person tied up who, for some unfortunate reason, is also there. So the question here is, do you pull the lever and sacrifice that one person to save five, or do you do nothing? And yeah, I feel like there should be a less kind of horrible sounding version of this. I don't know. But, and this is where ethics becomes really interesting because, there's a lot of different sort of ethical philosophies. And if you're looking at things like consequentialists or consequentialism and so the utilitarians and so forth, which look at that sort of greater good type view on things, then you would argue that you should pull the lever. Because if you pull the lever, then you're minimizing harm, and that's a better outcome for, well, obviously not for that person up there, but for the greater good, it's a better outcome because, one is less horrible than five. I mean, I don't think it all sounds horrible, but anyway, deontologists would argue that actively causing harm, so basically taking that decision yourself and pulling the lever, is actually wrong, even if the outcome is worse. So this is where, this comes up a lot. As I mentioned, this comes a lot with things like autonomous systems and autonomous vehicles. You've probably heard that one before with, the self-driving cars and what decision does it make and how does it decide and who decides and those sorts of things. So that's certainly a dilemma. Obviously, this is a very sort of worst case almost scenario type situation. But yeah, this is really how, in terms of AI and autonomous systems, it's used to sort of discuss how AI should make those life and death decisions. And yeah, as I said, in things like the self-driving cars and medical triage type things. And then that question about who was responsible for making those decisions and the decisions made by machines and who is accountable for those decisions. So anyway, don't want to stare at this much longer. Let's keep going. So a few dilemmas that we've encountered. So we've had some bias in AI development, and bias in algorithms. So we've had things like bias in data selection and model training. We've seen, I mean, so there's been a few examples. So one, I don't know if anyone remembers I don't know, Jack, if you remember this, but does anyone remember that? I think when X was still Twitter, there was a Microsoft bot that a bit of Microsoft AI that was put up, and within the space of a day, because it learns, right? So it's learning based on the what people are basically tweeting at it. It had basically become evil, so it became like racist and all sorts of things, and so they had to take it down. So that's kind of an example of very bad training. But if you look at something like Amazon, for example, so Amazon had developed a recruiting tool. So this was a little while ago. It kind of went a bit quiet, but Amazon developed a recruiting tool, an AI recruiting tool that was designed to automate things like resume screening and identify top talent. Again, when we talk about bias, what the model did was it downgraded particular resumes. Um, and so what it actually did was if you look at, I think there's an article on it from, I think it was Reuters, it was Forbes, one of them. But if the resume included the word like women, so women's chess club champion, or graduate of a women's college, it downgraded the resume. And so how did this happen? So this was based on the data that it was trained on. So the model was trained on, 10 years of resumes, and most of those resumes were from male candidates. So because of that, the algorithm and the AI became biased and started selecting, particular candidates and downgrading others. And so, looking at that, you end up with these kind of human perspectives shaping AI responses, and you end up with unintended consequences. So obviously, I mean, they shut that down, but that's again, and again, this was quite some time ago. So, this is kind of in the early days. So now I think, we kind of learn from that. And it's like, okay, these are the sorts of things that need to be considered, making sure that, things like bias don't occur. As I mentioned, surveillance versus privacy, that's another one. So AI, enables mass data collection and real-time monitoring. Like it could do things really quickly. Facial recognition, location tracking. I mean, facial rec is kind of all over the news at the moment. There's been various um, retail establishments that have been in trouble for using things like, facial rec and so forth, because then, what it is it's doing a particular task, but it's, potentially, you know, um, impacting people's right to privacy. And so things like, ethical concerns arise when surveillance infringes on individual rights and freedoms, e.g., right to privacy. So trying to balance that public safety with personal privacy is a key challenge, and certainly one that is definitely topical at the moment. Has had lots of media exposure, and so yeah, another example of an ethical issue. There is some legislation in place to protect privacy. So, Australian Privacy Act here is one example, EU GDPR, various other, pieces of privacy legislation across the globe, but it is varied and it is not uniformed across, every jurisdiction. Certainly, some jurisdictions have, leveraged things like EU GDPR, for example. But yeah, it is not the same. So obviously, jurisdiction is another thing that needs to come into it, and what laws are applicable there. And as I said, within Australia, which is where we're seeing at the moment a lot of that, sort of facial rec um, stuff in the news, that would be because it's going to be a potential breach of the Australian Privacy Act, alleged breach, one of those. Um, so the point is that, responsible AI demands clear consent, data minimization, and purpose limitation. So, what are you using for? Has the, subject consented to the use of their data for AI? And, is it minimal? Are you only collecting what is needed, not over collecting? Because that's another issue, right? And I won't even get into the whole it's a data gov thing, but the over collection of information when you don't need it. And then, looking finally here at automation versus job displacement. So as I said, I end up in a lot of conversations about this. Um, there's a lot of conversations about whether AI is going to displace, jobs. So, and as I said, what are my kids going to do, and kids, and so forth. And I have this conversation all the time. So AI-driven automation is transforming industry. It is increasing efficiency and reducing costs. Look, I'll be completely honest. In my day-to-day work, I use AI, but there's a caveat here, right? So I use it. So some of the stuff that I do is I do also develop software, and there's been situations where, historically I'd have to sit there for hours and nut through a problem and try and work out what on earth is going on. And I'll give you a particular example. So I've got a client at the moment, that I'm just sort of wrapping up a project on, and it's a database backend, and it's like a web front end. And the performance of the query was fine to begin with, but as the data set grew and it grew substantially, the performance started to become a little bit sluggish. And I took my query, I removed anything sensitive out of it, and I popped it into a corporate version of AI. And I said, can you make this query more efficient? And it kind of came back and spat it out very, very quickly, mind you. And I was like, huh. And it just added a couple of things. And I was like, oh, I didn't think of that. And the point was, I didn't think of that. And it took what probably would have been an hour of me kind of scratching my head going, how do I fix this, down into like 10 minutes. Now, why is that good because I got the by the way, it worked. It was fine. No issues. Put all the bits back in, plugged it back into the code, and off I went. And obviously tested it thoroughly. So there's the oversight. Am I testing? Is it working? Yes, it's working well. Is the, the output intended? Yes, it is. Excellent. Point is, like, it cost the client 10 minutes of time, not an hour of time, because I was able, and then that was more for me to do, spending on a whole bunch of other things. And then the view that the client knows that I used AI to fix that problem and a couple others, but he's gone, oh, well, here's some more stuff to do because now you're more efficient. So, but again, you kind of need to know what you're doing and I said have those processes in place to make sure that the outputs are good. The point is things like here, routine and repetitive jobs are going to be, vulnerable. That's probably a bit of an issue. So certainly those sorts of things need to be considered as well. And consideration needs to happen in terms of, well, if someone's going to get replaced, is there something else they could do? Can their skills be augmented and those sorts of things? But yeah. All right. So in terms of proceed with caution. So I firmly believe, and as I just sort of mentioned with the example that I use, that AI has a place. As I said, I freely admit that I use AI in certain use cases, um, but I use it for little bits of things, right? I don't just go, oh, go write me a thing and just expect the output's going to be correct. I'm like, okay, I need to solve very little specific problems all over the place because it does a very good job at that. But it needs to be used ethically and with strong governance and risk practices, right? So it needs to be managed. And here are some examples, and I just took some little screen clippies of a few things that have happened, over the last, well, probably the last 12 months. And so there's a few law ones in here. But what's actually happened is there's been several instances where lawyers, for example, have relied on the output from AI as part of their case, and they've taken it to court. And what's happened is, it's hallucinated, right? So it's done that thing where AI doesn't really know, so it just makes it up. And what's happened is they've then submitted those documents with those hallucinations or that misinformation, and then they've been found out because someone's gone, "What are you talking about?" Or they've gone to look up, the precedent or the case and gone, "This doesn't exist." So this is where it's really important to say, don't not use AI. It's about using it responsibly, using it properly, and having those controls in place to make sure that, this sort of stuff doesn't happen because yeah, it's happened clearly, as you can see here. There's a couple from Victoria. There's one from, from Wales up there. There was another case, I don't think it's on here, but there's one in the US. And then if you look at what OpenAI, there's an OpenAI headline there. They admit that the hallucinations are mathematically inevitable, not just engineering flaws. So yeah, I think that's me kind of drilling home that this is an important topic. And yeah, over the next, well, this was week one, but the next 3 weeks, we'll get into how to deal with some of that stuff, how to kind of build out that AI management, governance, risk compliance program, and yeah, then do a bit of an application of it. Cool. That's what I've got. Before I get to questions, as I said, with the introduction for next week is the introduction to GRC for AI. So we'll look at things like key frameworks to support risk management, compliance strategies. So things like AI risk management framework. As I said, I'll touch on 42001 with a bit of a deep dive the following week. Look at the OECD AI principles, and then also look at the Australia's, what do you call it, voluntary for now AI safety standard. But that's it that I have for tonight. So I guess is it question time?
I dare say it might be. Uh, we have quite a few questions in the chat.
Hang on a sec.
Sorry, let me just have a little bit of a look. We've got quite a few that have accrued across the whole situation. I might keep it to some of the more general questions just because it's been some time since some of this was covered. But Joshua's asked, interested in your thoughts on the allocation of ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini being classed as narrow AI, with the advent of multimodal tools and their ability to be given tools now to achieve tasks outside of their training, are there, so I suppose, are there kind of, you know, finer points to that definition of what counts as narrow or not narrow AI? And is there a particular point at which something could supersede that allocation, I suppose?
Yeah, and look, I think we're certainly moving towards that direction. I don't think we're there yet. I mean, it's still going to only operate, kind of within the bounds of what it's programmed to do. But I think, that's certainly where we're going. We're starting to move towards that general AI. So yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, yeah, as I said, we will. I have no doubt we'll get there. But yeah, that ability to, kind of step outside that will certainly move us towards Gen. I got to. It's very confusing. General AI, not Gen AI, because Gen AI is already here, which is narrow AI. But yeah, I think that's where we're heading.
I suppose that actually leads really well into the next question, which is it possible for generative AI to learn beyond their training models, or are they limited to what they're trained with?
No,
Because
so right
I know
now,
that currently they essentially are limited to their training information, but that is rapidly expanding, is it not?
well, that's right. So that's exactly where we are. So where we currently are at, they're only able to provide outputs based on what they know, how they're sort of, what they're trained with, the data that's been fed into them. So that's where we're currently at. But, I guess to the previous point, eventually we're going to see that expand. And that's when things start to get a bit scarier because that's when, it's going to be less constrained by that and it's going to be able to, think like a human. And so that was the key thing. When you get to general AI, it's basically like a artificial person um, with, similar levels of intelligence. When you get to super AI, that's when I'm going to go and live in the bushes somewhere or something, because then it's going to be smarter than all of us. Um, so yeah, that's where I think that's where we're going to end up eventually. These things evolve, and as you know, as you kind of looked, in the 40s, it was like a mechanical calculator. Look at where we are today. It's just a matter of time, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've got a great couple of questions. I might just tie the two of them together from Michael, who says, on human centered values, whose values should be followed if there are disparities among human groups? And on human oversight, whose accountability is it when data leaks happen through AI and AI agents?
Yeah, so who should be followed if there are disparity among human groups? I probably wouldn't mind a little bit more context on that, but to try and answer that, I mean,
I mean,
trying
I
to,
could make an approximation if you'd like.
well, I was going to say, I mean, it's pretty hard to answer without saying, trying to find consensus. Um, you know, it's probably a matter of trying to identify what those values are and then trying to find a sort of happy middle ground in terms of, which values are important. Well, they're all going to be important, but you know what I mean? Like, as in which ones are the ones that are going to be applicable to whatever you're building. So yeah, I'm trying to think of how to answer that question because just when there's conflict, it gets hard. I mean, I'm not going to use this token. Well, let's just set up a committee for that because that seems like where everyone ends up. But yeah, look, I think I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer about whose values should be followed. I think it's a decision on who's responsible for governing the AI to determine what values need to be included, depending on several factors like that's yeah, I don't think there's a exact answer for that one.
Yeah, I
In terms
suppose
of
that's probably a question that a lot of ethicists have spent many years before the advent of AI trying to pore over and still very much are. So a little bit unfair of you to have to answer that on the spot
but
right now.
but yeah, look on human oversight, whose accountability is it when I mean that's the same thing. So when data leaks happen through AI and agents, I think ultimately the accountability is not with the AI itself. It's going to be with, and if you look at a lot of the legislation, for example, so if I take this again, kind of probably needs a bit more research into things like use cases and what sort of data, what jurisdiction, all those sorts of things. But if you take the kind of general, I hate to do general responses, but in terms of human oversight, who's accountable, when a data leak happens, think about, a lot of the, for example, privacy laws. The privacy laws will, and a lot of the security best practice type, guidance will say that whoever collected the data and is effectively the custodian of that information is the person that's responsible for it. And then who's that individual? I don't know. It depends on the structure of an organization. So, if I, as a business, collect information from, you know, person A, and then I plug it into AI, and then there's a leak, I mean, I feel like I would be accountable for that because I collected it and then I did something with it, but it was entrusted to me to look after. So yeah, but again, lots of variables.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Werner who asks, where does synthetic data fit with regards to AI ethics? Many of these models are trained with a large volume of synthetic data, with which poses some interesting questions when it comes to the onus of responsibility. And I'd like actually to just tie that in with another question, asking what methods can be employed to verify the validity of AI generated outputs. I feel those go well together.
All right, so where does synthetic data fit in with regards to AI ethics? Many of these models are trained with large volumes of synthetic data, which poses interesting questions when it comes to onus of responsibility. I mean, synthetic data, that's interesting. So if you're putting in synthetic data, again, use cases, it's going to come down to, whether that's going to introduce any potential issues. So obviously, if you're putting in synthetic data and there's going to be well, are we assuming it's synthetic data mixed in with real data? Assume so. So that could potentially create biases. That's a potential problem. You know, it's a bit of a tricky one, but I think that's probably where you're going to see most of it. Um, in terms of interesting when it comes to the onus of responsibility, I'm trying to think of what Werner's trying to ask exactly. So many of these models are trained with large volumes of synthetic data. Like I feel like bias is because you could basically influence it if using synthetic data, or it's just dud data. So I don't know how valuable the output's going to be. Um, but yeah, I probably wouldn't mind a bit more info on that one. Like, is there
Fair
a
enough.
particular use case?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess maybe that's one for the forums at learn.itmasters.edu.au. I suppose the maybe we could narrow it to what methods there are that exist to verify the validity of those AI generated outputs.
Yeah, and what's the purpose for using the synthetic data as well?
Absolutely. We are also we've got a question from Don. Shout out to Don Tibbets, by the way, always in every single one of these short courses.
I feel
Uh,
like I see him at every one of the ones that I run.
Absolutely, and always has really insightful questions. So thanks, Don. Don says common generative AIs already display attitude, even if it just looks like eagerness to please, sometimes extending to cheekiness. Is this a sign of nascent personality? And how do you think this sits with current stated use cases?
Um, Wait, which use cases?
I suppose the stated I would say that this question is probably around things like the interactions that people have with GPT-5, for example, in which they feel that has a personality that relates to their own. So maybe the use cases such as people using AI as a sort of companionship or as like a
Yeah,
counselor almost is
and
potentially an application where this is
look,
relevant.
I think it could be a sign of nascent personality. As I said, like we've already seen examples, like as I said, with the whole Twitter Microsoft thing of basically a bot being able to be given personality or but they turn the thing racist like in a day. So it's like, and it was just started to like insult people and things like that. So it does like they do learn, obviously again within the bounds of the kind of programming. But yeah, I think that's definitely a thing, and I think we're going to see more of that, which again goes into that kind of a bit scary realm. But yeah, I think I've seen it kind of be a bit cheeky and a little bit kind of smart aleck to me before. But yeah, I think that's definitely a sign. I mean, they do learn. Um, so they learn from what they gather, right? And so when you're putting inputs, that's information that it's gathering. So, if you're cheeky or if someone else is and it adds that to its knowledge bank of training data, then what's to stop it?
Yeah, I've read a couple of accounts in which people have been sort of explaining that essentially as the user you are driving the AI, and so it's kind of a mirror of all of the inputs that it's had, whether that's from you or from other users. So is it personality to reflect prior inputs? And I guess that is really getting much more into the like broader philosophical questions of like, what are our personalities if not reflections of our experiences? Which you could call theoretically data inputs as well. But
Uh,
that's me getting a
look,
little bit indulgent.
well, look, I've got kids, and sometimes I'm like, oh, where did you get that from? And I'm like, oh, wait, no, I think I
Mm-hmm.
know.
That's very relatable. Well, let's go for a slightly more pragmatic question. I've got one here from Evan, and we might just take a couple more questions just in order to finish on time. But Evan asks, George, you were talking about your use of AI, but you're clearly an expert and can quickly understand when it's giving you bad outcomes. There was an article posted in the Harvard Business Review yesterday around AI generated work slop, quote unquote. If we want to avoid work slop, where bad decisions or work is pushed downstream within an org to deal with and ensure AI adds real value, should organizations limit its use or understand who can value add its use until such time as AI is objectively, quote unquote, better?
I think that's a great question, and you're right. I mean, I went very detailed in how I use it, and I do use it to fix very specific problems. And that obviously I can then back read the code and go, oh yeah, I could see what's happened here. Um, and so, um, sorry, that microphone's so sensitive. I think I just heard my son talk through the door and say, "Good night, Dad." So I don't know if anyone else heard that, but so in terms of how to avoid the work slop, I think this comes down to again, not so much limiting the use isn't what I'm looking for here, but it's providing guardrails, if you wish, on how to use it and how to use it responsibly, and kind of how not to use it, sort of thing. So if you know, I think a lot of this comes from someone pops open ChatGPT or they pop open Copilot or Claude or whatever, and they go, "Oh, go draft me this," right? And they just ask a very generalized question, and then it's just going to pull a whole bunch of stuff together, and then they'll just submit it, right? Now that's clearly work slop. Whereas if it's and like we look at the lawyer thing, right, where and the various lawyer things where it just cited random rubbish, again, that's almost out of a bit of quote laziness. So I think if the right um, strategies are in place to say, what should happen is use it to solve specific problems or to do little bits and pieces to put together, make sure, and then there's almost, as I said, like a QA process in place. This whole thing about pushing work downstream, well, that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, it kind of needs to go back up to get QA'd and reviewed. So it's about having those processes and that guidance in place to do that, not just sort of pushing it down, going, oh yeah, now just go shove it through AI and we'll just accept it as it is. So I think, and we'll get into a little bit of that, but I think that's where the key is. It's about how to use it responsibly and how to make sure that the outputs can be relied upon, not just kind of going, you know, don't use it at all. And also like what platforms should be approved? Should that people be using everything, or should you just be using corporate versions of platform X? Yeah, I think there's a lot to it. But yeah, that's kind of what my thinking is.
All right. Now, are there any questions that are in the Q&A section that you particularly would like to answer? Because I reckon we have time for maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. Sorry, there's an awful lot of questions in the Q&A
I know. I
section.
was looking at this one, but it seems it's very this one that was interesting about why is the voluntary AI standard not mandatory yet?
Mm,
I thought that was interesting. I know that's a bit of a shorter question, but it sort of piqued my interest when I sort of just scrolled because there are quite a few questions in here. It'd be good if we can, if someone's really, I think you mentioned before, someone really wants to get one answered, throw it into the discussion forum. Um, so look, I think with the voluntary AI standard. I don't know the exact answer. I've heard kind of bits and pieces talking about how, there's going to be, there's meant to be some regulation or legislation going in as well around, AI, similar to what the EU have done, right? So the EU have got their AI regulations that are effectively almost that equivalent of the GDPR, but for AI, although that GDPR does complement that and so forth, because there's a lot of privacy implications and things like that. And I know that Australia was working on that and they seem to have slowed down. And so, some of the reports that I've seen really kind of focus on the stifling of things like innovation. And so there is kind of almost that delicate balance between throwing in regulation and quote unquote red tape that can potentially impede the ability to innovate. And so this is interesting because this is also something that came up when I did my doctoral thesis. And so I interviewed many people about things like ethics and issues around professionalism and so forth, and it was kind of very tailored towards the sort of cybersecurity space. But a couple of people actually came back because I asked the question about regulations and legislation, and would there be any benefit or what their thoughts are on regulating that particular area, and they all said that, well, not they all didn't all say, but several of them said the same thing, which was that it can stifle and slow down innovation and so forth. And so I do wonder whether that's related, and I have seen references to that around the place. So I think when you start to make things more difficult, it slows things down. I guess the trade-off is it does create more risk. So it's a bit of an interesting one. And so I also remember having a similar conversation many years ago with somebody that I won't name them, but I, yeah, I definitely won't name them, but I asked them about whether Australia would see any particular regulation or legislation. It was around cybersecurity at the time, and so this was about it was 2017. And again, there was kind of a bit of a no. Two things. One, we're not ready. That was one reason. And the other one was that, there was a bit of a trust in the fact that organizations would sort of be on top of it and deal with it themselves. Take from that what you will. Fast forward, and we're starting to see that now, right? So it's come in. We were just a bit behind, and having lived and worked in the US for several years. By the way, I'm not saying whether any country is better or not, but I did find that they typically tend to be a little bit more advanced when it comes to things like legislation and regulation for certain industries. I bear that in mind because obviously, if you look at the US, they've got very kind of different laws for different states and all sorts of stuff, and I can't get my head around it. But certainly when we're looking at some of those emerging fields, they were a little bit more advanced than we were, probably by about 3 years. So I think, maybe we're just a bit lagging, and we will, I think it'll come. It'll just be just a matter of time.
Great. Well, I think that's as good a place as any to finish on. Thank you very much, George, for this fantastic webinar. Very much looking forward to the next one, which for everybody will be same place, same time next week. So that is next Wednesday. That will be at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. and, whatever the relevant equivalent timing is for your part of the world. Uh, all of the slides will be uploaded and the recording will be uploaded within 24 hours to learn.itmasters.edu.au. Again, as George mentioned just now, there was an enormous volume of questions in the Q&A. It was very difficult to select a couple. So we will definitely encourage everybody to head to those forums at learn.itmasters.edu.au and have a hopefully very lively discussion on those forums between yourselves and with George as well. Actually, there's something happening in the chat. Is it daylight savings in Australia next week? I
Starts
can't
2
scroll
a.m.
up because,
Sunday.
oh, right. Okay. So actually, it'll be 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time next week. So adjust your estimates by 1 hour. Apologies, everybody.
Well,
I
depends where you are.
that's true. From where we are, it'll be equivalent to where we are. So thanks everyone again. And again, just to answer a couple of those questions that were in the chat, there will be an exam for this subject. It will be available approximately 24 hours after the final webinar. You'll have one attempt at the exam, and we'll be giving more information about the exam in the coming weeks. In the meantime, all of this information that's been shared tonight will, again, like I said, be available at learn.itmasters.edu.au. Thank you very much to Lily Nguyen and also to George Thomas for taking us through this wonderful session. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.
Good night or good day.